Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Today I piggyback off of last week's video and determine which mystery novels by other authors are the Christie-ish. Now, I'm only going to cover authors whose works I've already ranked on this channel, so that would be Ngaio Marsh, Ellery Queen, Patricia Wentworth, Anthony Barkley Cox, and Dorothy L. Sayers. I'll also check in on the Sophie Hannah Poirot continuations. Just as a reminder, this is a comparison as to how Christie these books are, not an assessment of quality. I wanted to do this to give my listeners some suggestions on which books to start with if you're looking into getting into other authors' works. Now, I think I would still recommend the books at the top of my rankings for those authors, as some of my results from this experiment are a bit iffy, but we'll get into that. And for a refresher on my criteria, check out my previous video on what makes an Agatha Christie novel, which I will link here. Before I begin, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below. Let's start with Ngaio Marsh and her gentleman sleuth Roderick Allen. Now, this is sort of weird because I think Ngaio Marsh novels feel similar to Agatha Christie's, but I would say what makes a Ngaio Marsh novel is very different from what makes a Christie novel. Ngaio Marsh tends to have convoluted murder plots and unusual weapons. She tends to incorporate larger scale motives like drug smuggling and spy rings. She gives detailed descriptions, especially about New Zealand and the mechanics of behind the scenes at the theater and the arts. Marsh rarely misleads as to what her actual plots are. She's not often doing the Christie thing of tricking the reader into believing an entirely different plot is afoot. I didn't consider it a characteristic of a Christie novel because it's not really unique to her, nor does she originate it, but Christie is concerned about maintaining the status quo. Not that she doesn't critique it at times, but Ngaio Marsh goes full throttle against the status quo many times. As a result, Ngaio Marsh doesn't have a lot of high ranking novels on this Christie metric. That doesn't mean she doesn't have great novels. I think she does, but Marsh's works is more her unique style than some like of emulating Christie. The least Christie-ish Roderick Allen novel is mostly a thriller book of When in Rome, which involves drug smuggling, though there is an actual murder afoot here. It scored a 4, only receiving points for being set in a specific time and place, which is a Christie characteristic Ngaio Marsh typically does have and usually does an excellent job of it. The 4 novels that scored in the 30s are all novels I highly rank. Overture to Death and Final Curtain are the runners up with 30 and 31 points, respectively. That makes sense to me. Overture to Death is a country village mystery, and Final Curtain is a book with a large dysfunctional family. They very much feel like Christie novels on the surface. I would definitely recommend them. There is a tie at the top spot with 32 points for both Survey of Lampreys and Death and the Dancing Footman. Again, these make sense, but they wouldn't have been the books I would have thought of. Survey of Lampreys, another humorous dysfunctional family mystery, missed out on having an in your face solution. This book tends to be controversial amongst Ngaio Marsh fans for whatever reason, and Death and the Dancing Footman came as a surprise to me. It's a novel that, in my opinion, has grown considerably over time. It's a murder in a country house isolated during a blizzard. It's very heavy on the human nature and psychological aspects. However, Alan is barely in it, though, so this may not be a good place to start. It missed out on having its darkness hidden by light. The darkness here is very much at the forefront, despite some moments of humor, especially with the titular dancing footman. The mood is sullen and dark. My top 2 ranked novels by Ngaio Marsh were Artist in Crime and Death in the White Tie, which scored 25 and 14 points respectively. They feel very much like unique Ngaio Marsh novels. I still think I would recommend people begin with those books because they start this trajectory of Marsh novels where she just has like a streak of just fantastic works right in a row. So I would recommend probably starting with Artist in Crime still. Let's move on to Ellery Queen. And it's difficult for me to describe what an Ellery Queen novel is because there are very clear, distinct eras of Ellery Queen, with the books being characteristic of that era. The early nationality titles tend to be hyper focused on the mystery more than anything else and almost too much. Then we have the Ellery and LA arc, which start to incorporate more psychological nature. And then we have some thriller stuff in there as well. And then we have the Wrightsville era, which tend to be the more traditional murder mysteries. And then finally, we have this end stretch where Ellery thinks he can play God, and they also feature mostly traditional mysteries, some thriller in there as well. Pulpy is the word I would use to describe Ellery Queen in general. It's definitely like the buzzword for this series. I mean, there was an Ellery Queen pulp magazine at one time. The stories by the cousins and the magazine were typically lurid and sometimes unpleasant. They explored topics not normally explored in mystery novels or literature in general, and they weren't afraid to go certain places where others would not have. Like they talk about homosexuality in one book, they give like talk about like evolution and sort of like weird religious stuff at times. And because Ellery Queen is American, it's just a totally different style from Christie, who is British. Many Queen novels did not score very high, although very few scored like in the single digits, and they're mostly in average with the other authors' work. The least Christie-ish Queen novel is The Four of Hearts, which scored a 5, and that was a surprise to me because this is at least a traditional murder mystery, a very convoluted one, but one I thought would score higher than some of the bigger concept thrillery sort of ones. We actually do have a Queen novel with a perfect Christie score of 35, but the runner up with 34 points is The Last Woman in His Life, which is a novel I've always had mixed feelings about. It lacks the traditional summation gathering, which I should say at this point, I'm not so sure that should even be an element of this formula. I've been inconsistent, I think, in the way I count them because you have all different variations on this. Sometimes you don't have a summation gathering until after the murderer is revealed. I do need to reevaluate that aspect, but I still included it here for consistency's sake. But The Last Woman in His Life has a pretty shocking reveal, at least for the era. But with a perfect score of 35 is Calamity Town, the first of the Wrightsville era books, and the first, in my opinion, of the cousins who make up the author Ellery Queen really take off here. They were on this trajectory of more traditional Christie style murder mysteries for a while, and this is the book where it all comes together for me. And this also wasn't a surprise because the Mirror Cracked scored 34 points in my Christie video, and there are a lot of similarities between those two books, and I think that's vague enough not to spoil either of them. This is both a large family and a country village mystery. I think this is the perfect book to get into Ellery Queen with. I never recommend reading Ellery Queen in chronological order because I feel like most people would give up after the first book, which just has not aged well. And those nationality titles in general have a lot of issues in regards to the portrayal and descriptions of pretty much everyone who isn't a red blooded American straight white male. It's much worse in those books than books by other authors from the time. But by the time Calamity Town, maybe a little earlier, those issues have largely been cleaned up. So I do think Calamity Town is the ideal place to start. Onward to Miss Silver books written by Patricia Wentworth, which you may remember are not my favorites to say the least. I see a lot of like fellow booktubers on here making videos with really outrageous claims that Miss Silver is just like Miss Marple, which I mean, come on. Other than being elderly spinsters who solve crimes, they really couldn't be more different. Anyone who thinks these books are similar to Miss Marple novels really just doesn't have a deep grasp of Miss Marple. I mean, Miss Marple just runs laps around Miss Silver. But anyway, what is a Patricia Wentworth novel? I should begin here by saying I have not read any other series by Patricia Wentworth. I know she has other books like Benbow Smith Collection, but I have only read Miss Silver, but I'm assuming her books are mostly the same. Almost all of the Miss Silver novels have the same formula. There's a pair of young lovers, typically not very bright, who want to get married but can't for some reason, and that reason is removed via murder, either by that person being murdered or being the murderer. There is typically some kind of minor thriller element going on, like drug smuggling or jewel theft. There's sometimes international affairs going on. Miss Silver typically does not solve the actual crimes, but typically just like stumbles upon the solution somehow. She claims to do the Miss Marple thing of studying human nature, but she really doesn't do very much of that. There are rarely clues for the reader to use to try and solve these murders, which, to be fair, aren't really necessary, as the killer is typically very much indicated from early on. As a result, Miss Silver books typically did not score very high on my Christie metric. The top ranked book here only scored a 27, with few other books in like the mid 20s. These books mostly missed out on the bigger point items like obfuscation and the more human nature, psychological aspects. The least Christie-ish Miss Silver novel is a tie between Pilgrim's Rest and Lady's Bane, with 6 points each. Both of these books have ridiculously incredible plots that didn't even have the upside of being like interesting in their ridiculousness. The two runners up tied with 25 points are Miss Silver Deals with Death and Miss Silver Comes to Stay, two of the better books in the series, in my opinion. They are much easier reads that do actually have some clues and substance of merit. But the most Christie-ish Miss Silver novel with 27 points is Mr. Brading's collection, which I mentioned in my Miss Silver rankings that this book does have like the traditional Christie mystery puzzle here, but it does it very poorly. It's very clear what's happening in this book, but it does meet the criteria because, again, this formula does not measure quality. In terms of using Mr. Brading's collection as an introductory novel, I mean, fine, I guess. I mean, I really have no strong opinions on the order of reading these books because it doesn't really matter. I mean, sometimes characters do appear, from previous books and or mentioned, but I mean, really, it doesn't matter. And quite frankly, I just don't really care that much about Miss Silver to really give it much more thought. Next up is Anthony Barkley Cox, or Francis Isles, or whatever name you want to refer to him as. And this was also tough because I think Barkley is the closest author to Agatha Christie. Like, if I just guessed without having like an actual formula, but his books aren't really that similar to hers. In the same way Agatha Christie liked to challenge and break the rules of detective fiction, she really pushed the standard of what a mystery novel can do. Anthony Barkley also experimented. He was always willing to try new things and come up with new ideas with shocking revelations. So as a result, his books also didn't score too highly on this metric. Some of his books aren't really true mystery novels either, which also affected their scores. I still think he's the second best mystery author after Christie, but his works are oddly very different from hers, but still have that like wow factor Christie's biggest novels had. The least Christie-ish of his books is The Silk Stockings Murders, which is a serial killer novel somewhat akin to the ABC murders. This actually did worse on the Christie metric than the likes of Before the Fact and Mr. Priestley's Problems, which aren't even mystery novels at all. There's not even like a thriller, secret agent kind of aspect in them. The runner up is Second Shot with 26 points. This one is a Roger Sherringham novel set in a country house with a parlor game like setting. Not exactly a parlor game, but close enough. The title of most Christie-ish Anthony Barkley novel is the standalone novel Not to Be Taken with 28 points. And this one I dinged a bit in my ranking because it isn't the big concept novel like almost all of other novels by Anthony Barkley are, but that works to its benefit in the Christie metric. It's a poisoning mystery in a country village and focuses very heavily on the psychological aspects of its characters. This book feels like one Christie would have written, and in fact, she does have several poisoning novels that function similarly to this one. In terms of using Not to Be Taken as the first Barkley novel to read, I think it's a decent choice. It feels very Christie esque and is a shorter, easier read of his. It is a bit unrepresentative of his works in general, but even the Sheringham series, you really don't need to read them in any order. They more or less all function as standalones. One or two of the Sheringhams do spoil previous books, but it does so in such a way that you wouldn't even notice if you haven't read those other books. So you have nothing to worry here. And I think Not to Be Taken is also not very problematic like some of his other works could be. So I do think this is a good place to start. We have another queen of crime to discuss here in Dorothy L. Sayers and her sleuth, Lord Peter Wimsey. Believe it or not, I found Sayers to be the least Christie-ish of the authors in this video, except for one. And right off the bat, none of the Lord Peter Wimsey novels received points for economic writing or having an in-your-face solution, which took 8 points away right away. And Sayers is a lot of things, but an economic writer, she is not. And I challenge anyone to convince me that she is. It is interesting that when I was doing this exercise, I realized the four different queens of crime have completely different styles. Now, I'm not covering Marjorie Allingham's Albert Campion novels in this video because I haven't ranked them yet, but fear not, Campion is coming hopefully in about a month or so, maybe a little longer. Anyway, Sayers is definitely more interested in creating the scene and introducing us to a bunch of historical background and motives that I don't know are the most riveting. Her mysteries are definitely more convoluted than Christie. I would argue a little bit, but not quite on like the hard boiled side. There's often some kind of professional criminal element involved. The least Christie-ish Lord Peter Wimsey novel is a tie between Whose Body and The Nine Tailors with 10 points each, which is actually pretty high for like the bottom ranked books here. Whose Body is the first book, and it involves a lot of unusual and convoluted plot points. I don't want to get too much into it without spoiling, but there are a lot of A. Christie things going on here. And The Nine Tailors is a mystery novel that also has these big scale, like jewel theft operations. I always say this one reads like a college textbook about church bells. I really think that's what Sayers wanted from this book. A lot of unusual things going on there for a mystery novel. There's also a three-way tie for the top spots with 22 points each. I have The Unpleasantness at the Bellana Club, Strong Poison, and Gaudy Night. Now, Gaudy Night surprised me because it's not even a murder mystery. There is no murder in this book, but what Sayers does there is similar to how Christie formulates her murders. The Unpleasantness at the Bellana Club and Strong Poison were the obvious picks for me, and I was surprised they didn't actually score higher than 22 points. They both come across as mysteries Christie would write, and in fact, she has very similar books to both of them. Strong Poison and Sad Cypress share a lot of similarities, which may have been intentional on Christie's part, and The Unpleasantness at the Bellana Club has a lot of elements of Taken at the Flood, and I guess you can mix in like Elephants Can Remember there. The Bellana Club and Strong Poison have the same breakdown. In addition to lacking economic writing and an in your face solution, they both also lacked conventional murder plots, with the murder mechanics being a little too much to believe anyone would actually do these things in real life. Though I will say the Bellana Club does better in this regard than Strong Poison, but you still get a lot of entertainment from these plots. They're not bad plots, they're just not like Christie esque plots. Gaudy Night actually received points for a conventional murder plot, although there I used the actual criminal plot that was going on rather than a murder since there wasn't one. Instead, it lacked being led down the wrong path, as we are pretty much informed of what the plot is and what is going on without the actual solution being too far from that. I think new Sayers readers would want to start with either the Bellana Club or Strong Poison because they have the strongest mystery plots, and her writing can be difficult to get into, and the mystery here in those books make it easier. I wouldn't start with Gaudy Night since there's no murder, and you really need a sense of Lord Peter and Harriet Vane's relationship for you to get everything you need to out of that book. The final author I decided to look into here is Sophie Hannah, who writes the Poirot continuations. And I was curious to know how Christie-ish her books were. And you can listen to my thoughts on her books in my previous video on the subject. And again, this metric is not an assessment on how well Sophie Hannah or any of these authors execute these traits, just whether or not they exist in their books. So, how did Sophie Hannah score on the Christie metric? Not high. Her average was just slightly above 12 points, which is by far and away the lowest. Everyone else in this video was within 1 point of each other in like the 16 to 17-ish point range. I was actually surprised at this because I did feel as if Sophie Hannah made conscious efforts to recreate Christie's style in some regards, but her five Poirot novels scored between 10 and 17 points, with Closed Casket being the top scorer. The issue is really that Hannah's plot mechanics don't function like Christie's do. None of her books scored points for a conventional murder, as there was always like some aspect of the mechanics that just didn't ring feasible to me. She often doesn't lead the reader down the wrong path, as her book's quandaries are presented up front. she misses out on the larger point items, which are the most important ones. She typically doesn't set her books in a specific time and place, and they don't make commentary about the era in which they are set, which, to be fair, is because these are historical mysteries. They are not set in the era in which Sophie Hannah is writing them. This is a very common issue with historical mysteries, as no amount of research into the past is going to have the same feelings about that time as someone writing in that time. The Monogram Murders was the least Christie-ish book, which didn't surprise me. It's really a plot Christie never used. It's not that it's a bad plot or anything, it's just like not one I could see Christie using in her repertoire. And that is it for this lengthy project and video. Now, some of you asked for the full data for Christie's books, and I do have it. And I do also for all of the books by all of the authors in this video. I do need to clean up my spreadsheets and to make it legible as, like my thoughts, they're very messy, but I will post that at some point whenever I get around to that. No promises it will be anytime soon, but I hope this video encouraged someone to branch out into new authors. Next week, I will be ranking the top 10 Christie novels most in need of an adaptation or a new adaptation. There are many adaptations of Christie's works out there, but it always seems like we keep getting the same few books again and again and again. So stay tuned for that. Until next time, Mystery Files.